All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Sabasic-Luxton. I'm the Director of Research and Training here at the Dibble Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, From Adversity to Resilience, a Framework for Hope. We are thrilled to have Jessica Herzog Hall from the ACEs Indiana Coalition here to present on this topic, and I'll introduce Jessica shortly, but before I do, there are a couple of housekeeping things to get to. So let's get to those. For those of you who have been with us on webinars before, you'll see that this is our first time hosting on a new platform, which means some of our tips and technical questions have changed a little bit. The first one, if you cannot hear this presentation, I encourage you to check your audio settings located in the control panel. Make sure the sound is coming from the correct speaker, and if it is, but you still can't hear anything, try testing your audio. If that doesn't do the trick, then we suggest dialing in on your phone to listen in. The other is that you'll find handouts located in the chat box, which is also in your control panel. We'll share them shortly, again later in the presentation so that they're easy for you to find, and they'll also be shared with the recording that will be available a couple of days after today's webinar. If you have questions for us, please go ahead and send those in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to answer those either as we move along or at the end of the session if they are for our presenter. And also I wanted to point out that closed captioning is available for you to use in your control panel, so feel free to take advantage of that function. Okay, so for those of you who are new to us here today, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction about the Dibble Institute and who we are, if you're wondering how we got our name. On this slide, you're going to see a picture of Charlie and Helen Dibble. They are the founders of the Dibble Institute. Charlie did a lot of work with youth during his retirement, and he saw a lot of them having difficulties around their relationships, or when their parents were having difficulties in their relationships, there was an impact on those children. So he had the brilliant idea to translate research into teaching tools that could then be made widely available. So while the Dibble Institute is not a direct service provider, we do develop research-based practices and make them available for people like yourselves and others throughout the country, which brings me to our next slide here. The Dibble Institute is an independent national nonprofit organization. We have clients in all 50 states who are providing direct services. And last year, based on our conservative estimates, we believe our clients reached almost 115,000 youth based on materials that they've purchased and things such as that. So we just want to say that we're very grateful to all of you who are here, who are doing this important work with youth. So thank you for your service with them. Now, a little bit more about us. We are guided by our mission, and our mission is to help young people successfully navigate their intimate relationships through important information. We want to help them build their knowledge around relationship building and grow these different skills and practices. And we know that when we have these conversations with youth, that it pulls a lot of levers. So pregnancy prevention, DV prevention, mental health, which is relevant really to today's topic, job readiness, and more. Actually, today's topic really aligns with all of those things, which is why we're really excited to have Jessica here. The other work or thing that guides our work is our values. We are big believers in research. All of our programs are research-based, and we continue to strive for evaluations on our programs to demonstrate their impact and effectiveness. This also means that with new research that comes out, there are updates made to our programs, and we incorporate new information to better serve the young people. And that includes, again, highlighting the work that we've got here today as it relates to our curriculum Mind Matters, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end. Another core value is that we believe in safe, stable, and healthy nurturing families of all formations. So again, this framework of adversity to resilience, this hope framework that we're going to be talking about today, really aligns beautifully with that. And our goal is for young people to be raised in these families. And lastly, we believe that relationship education is for everybody. All of us can improve our relationships. All of us can work to grow and strive and do better and be better. And so we want to make sure that our programs are reflective of that. So that's a little bit about the Dibble Institute, but y'all are here for the wonderful work that Jessica will be highlighting in just a moment. I want to point out that Jessica is a trauma-informed leader and educator with a strong commitment to community resilience and healing. She earned her Master's of Social Work in 2021 from Indiana University of Social Work, where she was recognized as the outstanding MSW, so Master's in Social Work, Student of the Year. Her graduate work and professional career have focused on understanding the lifelong impact of trauma and creating systems that foster safety, connection, and healing. Jessica currently serves as the director of the ACEs Indiana Coalition at the Indiana Youth Services Association, where she leads statewide efforts to educate, equip, and connect organizations around trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and resilient science. She's a certified ACE interface master trainer, a hope framework facilitator, and trained in mind body medicine, and holds a graduate certificate in applied educational neuroscience from Butler University. So it's very clear her passion lies in helping communities become more trauma informed, resilient, and connected. And I know that her work has really helped in the formation of the updates coming to Mind Matters. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jessica.
Well, thank you so much for that, Rachel. I greatly appreciate it. It is a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon, or depending on where you're at, who knows? But it's wonderful to be with all of you. I will let you know, Rachel, that I am unable to currently share my screen at the moment, but if you want to give me the power to do so, that would be wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much. And then if you just wouldn't mind giving me a little thumbs up to make sure you're seeing that, okay? Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. This information is usually about 2 hours long. So we are going to be covering a lot of information in a short amount of time. But I really do encourage you to drop any comments into the chat box, ask questions so that we're really able to further our learning together and that connection through a virtual platform. So before we begin, I always want to take a moment that some of this information may be a bit activating to our nervous system. We're talking about things including trauma, loss, adversity, and sometimes we need to take a moment and care for ourselves. So, if at any point you need to take a step away, you need to take a little bit of a break, I really do encourage you to do what feels right to you and what feels right in your own nervous system and body, and that you and your presence is valued and respected here today. So, in relation to that, we are just going to take a moment and we are going to take a few deep breaths before we jump in. Our lives are so incredibly busy. We have so much going on a daily basis. So, it's really important that we're just taking this time to kind of center ourselves before we jump into learning and connecting with one another today. So, for a moment, feel free to get comfortable in your chair if you're sitting, or if you're standing at one of your standing desks, just feel comfortable and a little bit more weighted and centered. And you can either close your eyes or you can keep your eyes kind of open and just relax them. And when we are going to take these deep breaths, we are going to breathe in through our nose for 4 seconds and then breathe out for 5 or even longer if you're able to. The longer that we breathe out of our mouths, the more regulating it is to our nervous system. So go ahead and breathe in for 4 and breathe out for 5, 4, 5. And we'll do that 2 more times. Breathe in for 4 and breathe out for 5, 5. And one more time. Breathe in for 4 and breathe out for 5. Thank you so much. It's always so wonderful to take those deep breaths before we jump in to learning something new or maybe something that you're super familiar with. So, we are going to start at the very beginning. From the moment that our bodies are formed and our skeletal system begins to be developed and our heart begins to beat, our memories of our experiences are stored within our bodies. And this wasn't always the way we thought about this process. Back in the day, we thought perhaps some of our memories of our experiences could change our outlook on the world. Perhaps they could change parts of our personalities. But the very idea that we hold the memories of these experiences in our very cells and that those cells are passed from generation to generation is only something we are truly beginning to understand. So today is about discovery. It's about two individuals that were really exhausted with seeing the high rates of chronic health problems, and they really wanted to determine what was at the root of a lot of the chronic, whether it be physical, mental, behavioral problems that we see. So these are the two gentlemen that we'll be talking a lot about today, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti. And these were the two principal investigators on the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 study participants. And the ACE study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, or behavioral problems later in life. But we are going to start with our human nervous system. So, when it comes to our human nervous system, we are specifically going to be talking about our brain and we'll be talking about our autonomic nervous system. And I start with our human nervous system because it is incredibly important that we're understanding these things as that foundational science. When we can understand this foundational science and what is going on, in our nervous system and in our brain, it's really helpful at starting to understand what are these reactions that we're seeing around us, what are those responses that we're feeling in our bodies, and how can we lead with more of that empathy in regards to a lot of these conversations and these relationships that we have. So at birth, we are born with very few neural connections. So you'll see over here on the left-hand side, we're really only born with those things that we need to survive. So eating, sleeping, connecting to a caregiver. And it is through all of these different experiences, these explosions of things that we learn, and all of these different things that we experience that we have all of these different neural pathways that grow and connect and strengthen. So you'll see in the middle here around elementary age, we have all of these beautiful neural connections that have been strengthened through repeated lessons and experiences. And that is beautiful when we are talking about things like science and math and language. But there's this process that occurs through puberty where our brain sits there and says, we cannot possibly keep all of these neural connections and all of these things that we have learned. We have to make room for new experiences and new lessons. So there's this process called pruning, where those neural connections that have not been strengthened through repeated experiences will die off and disappear, and those neural connections that have been repeated, those lessons that have been repeated, will strengthen and remain. And that is a beautiful process when we are talking about things like math and science and languages. However, when we're thinking about that through the lens of trauma and the things that we learn through those experiences and our reactions through those experiences, it can be very, very challenging to change those neural pathways and to be able to understand how embedded some of these reactions can be. Now, the beautiful thing about our brain and these neural pathways is that they can always change. No matter how old we can always grow and change our neural pathways. And that gives us a beautiful opportunity, especially for the children and adolescents that we may be working with or maybe in our personal lives. So I want you to imagine for a moment that we have two different worlds. In this first world, it's filled with a lot of danger. A child is constantly having to go through that fight, flight, or freeze process, and they're really surviving some of the worst conditions. Go ahead and type in the chat box, what do we think are going to be some characteristics of a child that grows up in that top world? And I'll give you a few moments to type your answers in that chat box.
I'm going to go ahead and open the chat up for everyone. Originally, people were able to chat with us as hosts and panelists, but I'm going to go ahead and open that to the group. So you should be able
Thank
to
you.
write in the chat box now.
All right, I see. Fear, anxiety, low self-esteem. Yeah, I'm still seeing in the chat is disabled.
Um, I will work on that. There we go. Now it's officially fixed. I clicked the wrong button. I apologize. The chat should is definitely up. We're getting lots of response.
Okay, perfect.
All good. That chat is going wild now.
All right. Hold on 1 second for me.
If you want me to read some off, Jessica, I'd be happy to do that. If that would be
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Sorry, my screen just had a little bit of an error there.
technology is great until it isn't. So we've got
There we go. Okay, we're on track. Here we go. All right, so I see anxiety, disassociation, isolation, acting out. Yes, yeah, insecurity, PTSD, absolutely. Distraction. Okay. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So many responses. Thank you so much. I so appreciate those. Yeah. Negative neural networks, sleep issues, anxiety, delayed speech. Absolutely. What about this bottom world? So a child that grows up in a very safe world, they have those caring and competent relationships. They're really surviving some of the best conditions, right? They may be a bit vulnerable to high stress scenarios, but what do we think is going to be some characteristics of a child that is growing up in this world? Well adjusted, safe, calm, high achiever, empathetic. Yeah, absolutely. So it's always really interesting with this exercise because my original question was, what characteristics can we see? And that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being maybe more negative characteristics or more positive characteristics. But with our brains, and we'll talk a lot about this today, our brains tend to be very negatively biased. Naturally, that is what our brains do. So when we think of certain characteristics, a lot of the time, certain labels and negative characteristics will be brought up, especially for individuals that grow up in this top world. And sometimes, and I think I noticed it in some of the responses here, in that bottom world, the word resilient gets assigned to those individuals that have grown up in that very safe world. And it doesn't always get associated with individuals that grow up in that top world. But the reality is, individuals that grow up in that top world are some of the most resilient individuals you will ever meet in your entire life. They have had to face some of the worst conditions and they have overcome them. And it's often thought that resilience is either this thing that you have or you don't have. And that is simply not the case. Every single one of us has resilience inside of us. And we want to think of resilience like a muscle. There are exercises and things that we can do that strengthen that muscle. Or there are some times when we don't practice those exercises that muscle can get weakened. That doesn't mean the muscle isn't there, right? It's still there. And there are things that we can always do to strengthen that muscle. So please kind of remember that process as we go through this information, because so often the systems that we work in, the areas that we work in, they require us to put some sort of label or attachment into that relationship. When the reality is, we are not getting the full picture. We want to be diving deeper into that relationship. We want to be building those connections because there is so much more than what we see at the surface. So this is our amazing brain. And specifically, I wish that we could have the time to kind of go through all of these different areas. But specifically, we're going to be talking about our limbic system because our limbic system is really key at understanding that fight flight process. So when we look at our brain, you'll see up here we have our prefrontal cortex, so that part of our brain that's in charge of executive functioning and logical reasoning. We have our brainstem down here and our limbic system in the green, and then we've got that amygdala within the limbic system. So specifically, the limbic system is vital for learning, memory, reward, reinforcement. It helps regulate our hormones, our mood, our heartbeat, our sexual behavior. And it is really the house of that fight flight process. So I want you all to imagine, and if you're familiar with Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, you may have heard this metaphor before. I want you all to imagine that we are in the woods and we are walking, everything is calm, we're taking those deep breaths in and out. And then all of a sudden, we come across a bear. What's going to happen is that our amygdala is going to start firing off adrenaline and cortisol. It's going to send messages to our heart to start beating faster so we can get ready to run or fight the bear. It's going to send messages to our muscles to fill with oxygen so we can get ready to run or fight the bear. And it's going to send messages to our prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that's in charge of that logical reasoning or executive functioning. And it's going to say, we don't need you right now. I don't need you logicking out how you are going to fight this bear. I simply need you to survive. So it pulls all of those hormones and chemicals away from the prefrontal cortex so we can simply focus on survival. And that is a beautiful process if you are in the woods and you come across a bear. But what if that bear lives with you? And we are going through that process day in and day out. We are going to see a lot of changes to this part of the brain. For example, we can see an amygdala that is smaller in size. We can see one that lacks blood flow to that part of the brain. And when we're talking about characteristics that can be seen, we can see almost like a spectrum. So on one end, we can have someone that is very, very disassociated. Those chemicals, that cortisol and adrenaline, have been firing off so frequently they're not really able to identify what is stress, what is normal. It's just complete disassociation. On this spectrum over here, we have that hypervigilance. So we can see someone that is waiting for danger around every corner. They may become a little bit, defensive, or they may kind of go into attack mode a little bit more because that adrenaline and cortisol is so dysregulated. It is firing off at the smallest thing. And that's really important because when we talk about this amygdala and the hippocampus, it's not just the fight flight process that we are discussing. We're also talking about our attention and our memory, and we're talking about our social cues. So, this part of the brain is also so vital for relationships, especially when we're talking about our development as we grow into adolescence and into adulthood. And remember that that prefrontal cortex is also shut down during that fight flight process. So when we think about those executive skills, when we think about that logical reasoning, it's so important that we also remember that this part of the brain may have not been activated as much as it normally would. So we may see someone that struggles with organization or time management or flexible thinking or emotional control because of those past experiences that have occurred, especially in childhood. With our autonomic nervous system, this is also a key part of this foundational science. Our autonomic nervous system helps with anything that's automatic. So, breathing, digestion, anything that we don't have to think about. And specifically, when we look at our autonomic nervous system, we'll be talking about our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. Think of the sympathetic nervous system as our gas pedal. So, it helps prepare the body for that fight flight process, and think of the parasympathetic nervous system as the brakes. It helps relax our body and bring us back down to homeostasis. So, when we think about our different nervous system states, I want us, as we're thinking about working with kids, to remember that as human beings, we are sensory and sensation based. So, for a lot of kids, especially if they don't have the language yet to really discuss how they're feeling, we have to be asking ourselves what is underneath some of the behavior that we're noticing. So, for example, we may see someone that is yelling or criticizing or blaming or hitting or throwing, but what are some possible feelings that are underneath those behaviors? Are they feeling fear or anxiousness? Are they feeling frightened or unlovable? Are they feeling stuck? And for those kids that don't have the language to explain these feelings, what are the sensations that they are feeling? Are they feeling teary or pounding or burning or tight or tension? And how we can talk about kids about these feelings so that they can better identify what those feelings are, what sensations they're feeling in their body, and what their nervous system is doing in this process as they're trying to help them survive and also help protect them. And this is the same throughout these nervous system states. So we have that flight process where we may see somebody that's fidgeting or avoiding or unfocused. Well, what are the possible feelings that are underneath this behavior? And taking that pause and really thinking about what is underneath these behaviors can really help create so much trust and so much connection between you and the youth or adult that you may be working with. Same goes with the collapsed and shutdown phase. So maybe somebody is absent, maybe we're seeing somebody who's zoning out or unresponsive, looking at what are those possible feelings underneath that, and then what are the possible sensations if they can't identify those feelings just yet. And then with that steady and grounded phase. So talking about, maybe they're focused and friendly and collaborative. And what are those feelings that they have? And what are those sensations that we have? Because those also need to be noticed and they need to be celebrated. We don't really celebrate anymore in today's society, and we need to be celebrating more. One of my favorite people, Rick Griffin, who's with the Community Resilience Initiative, talks about the importance of celebration. So, yes, we've got to be practicing this stuff when we're struggling, when our nervous systems are in this state, but also let's be practicing this when we're feeling good and we're feeling in that steady and grounded phase, and let's be celebrating those moments as well. And the last piece of this foundational science is the epigenetics. And epigenetics helps us to understand basically how experiences get under our skin and change the reading of our DNA. Now, I will not pretend to be an epigeneticist on any kind of level, but epigenetics really help us to understand things like generational trauma and historical trauma. They help us understand how different chronic health problems can be passed from one generation to the next generation. So, for example, you may have different generations of family that all struggle with substance use, specifically maybe alcoholism. And you see that generation after generation, even though they may have very different experiences. Epigenetics is very helpful when we're understanding this process and seeing that generational trauma occur. Now, what's also beautiful about epigenetics is that it's not just those negative experiences that can be carried down from generation to generation, it's also those positive experiences. And we're going to be talking about those in just a few minutes. And be remembering that with this foundational science, when biology collides with social and societal expectations, that's when we start to run into challenges. So, for example, a kid that's been diagnosed with ADHD, telling them to sit in a classroom, sit still, don't talk, just focus. That's not a fair expectation to put on that child. And there are really simple adaptations that we can put into place to help come alongside that child to help them feel safe and help them feel connected. So, before we jump into the ACEs study, I always want to preface this conversation with ACEs are not destiny. Just because you have a high ACE score or an ACE score in general does not mean you are doomed to experience all of these things. ACEs tend to create risk, and we want to be paying attention to those risks. But by no means are ACEs someone's destiny. And that's really important because a lot of the time when this science is talked about, it's talked about in a very determinative way. And we really want to make sure that when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, that we're bringing in the knowledge that yes, these can create risk, but there's also so many other things that we have to keep in mind, including positive experiences, resiliency, and what those relationships are like in that individual's life. So those two scientists that really started the ACEs studies, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti, really started with the question, does the risk for chronic health problems originate in childhood? That was really their main goal when it came to understanding what these different chronic health problems were and what the root of it was. So these were the top 10 adverse childhood experiences that were found within the original ACEs study. So you'll see that these are separated between household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse. So we have substance abuse, parental separation, mental illness. The language back in the 1990s was battered mothers. It's domestic violence because anyone can experience domestic violence. Criminal behavior. Then we have emotional or physical neglect, and then emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And you'll see that we have these separated for a total 10 ACEs score. Now, it's always really important to mention that in the ACEs study, there were either 55 or 65 total adverse childhood experiences that were found in those 17,000 people. These were the top 10. It's also really important to mention that the majority of the population that was studied within those 17,000 people were white, middle class, living in San Diego, California, and had health insurance because they had to have health insurance to be a part of the study. So when we're thinking about what those top 10 adverse childhood experiences are, those are going to change based on the population that is being studied. We still see high rates of trauma across the board in communities and in these different things in different populations, but there have been additional studies since then that have looked at ACEs in much more diverse populations, and those top 10 ASINs have been updated and expanded upon. So what they found were that ACEs are highly interrelated, where there was one ACE, usually about 87% of the time, a second adverse childhood experience was also occurring. And this was a breakdown of what that population looked like when it came to the ACEs score. The ACEs score was developed to give an aerial shot view of someone's life. Doctors Anda and Felitti really needed to have this information in a much more digestible way because 17,000 people were a whole lot of people. So they developed that ACEs questionnaire and that ACEs score to get that aerial shot view of someone's life so that they could really kind of dive deeper when it came to those interviews. So you'll notice that zero individuals in that population had, 33% in that population had zero ACEs, 26% had one, 16% had two, and so on and so forth. Now, I always want to take a moment because when people see that 33% had zero, we assume that means they haven't experienced trauma. And that is not the case. That simply means that they did not experience one of those top 10 that were originally found in that study. We also need to keep in mind that the ACEs questionnaire does not take into account the frequency or the severity of that experience. So, for example, somebody could have an ACE score of 1 and could have been horribly physically abused every single day of their childhood. They may have an ACE score of 3 and could have one example of some of those areas. And that is not to compare trauma. That is not to say one is worse than the other. It's simply to say that when we see this ACEs score, we are not getting the full story. So when we use that ACEs score as determinative, or we use that to create cut points for certain services, we can really start to run into a whole lot of challenges with people falling through the cracks that desperately need those services. And you may be wondering why I'm kind of honing in on this. And that's because we have seen a lot of mishandlings of the ACEs questionnaire. A lot of people hear this science and they want to immediately go out and collect all of the ACEs scores. However, I really want to caution you when it comes to that process because the ACEs questionnaire can not only be very triggering for folks, but it can also, again, not be a full picture of somebody's experiences. So you'll notice that the ACE score is not a diagnostic tool, and unfortunately, it is being used as such. It's not a screening tool. There are no cut points for decision making. And specifically, that's on there because we have had organizations in our state that have set the cut point of 4 or more ACEs. So if that individual scores a 4 or more, they are eligible for these services. If they do not score a 4 or more, they are not eligible for services. So you can imagine the amount of people that are falling through the cracks that so desperately need the services that they're asking for. It is not a predictor at an individual level. Again, it can help us understand risk and what to look out for. And it's also not a fun quiz. You'll notice that sometimes people will have the ACEs questionnaire on their website or they'll have it in their newsletter. And these are deeply personal questions that we're asking someone about some of the most traumatic events that they have experienced. And some may have not even been able to come to terms yet with what has happened. So it's really important that we are using caution when it comes to that ACEs questionnaire if we are using it, and that we're really finding other wonderful screening tools and other different ways to interact and really build that connection and trust with someone, because that is the beautiful part of that hope framework, that we have the ability to do that. They found that dose response relationship. So the higher the ACEs score, the more percentage of those that were experiencing different health problems. And I'll go through a few of these really quickly. So ACE score and liver disease, you see that dose response relationship. ACEs and depression between men and women, that dose response relationship that was found. And one of the strongest relationships that was found was between ACEs and suicide attempts. So, an individual that scored a 4 or more were almost 20 times as likely to have attempted suicide as someone who had an ACE score of 0. And this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the examples of ACE attributable problems that were seen in that study. And I want you to think about, how are we treating a lot of these problems? Most often, we are treating the symptoms. We are not rooting deeper into what happened in the past, into what happened in our childhoods. We're not necessarily asking those questions to determine how those childhood experiences are increasing the risk of these different health problems, and also what we can do to really help heal when it comes to a lot of these experiences. So remember that we see high ACE scores in populations. There is that increased risk of multiple health problems, and we see that intergenerational transmission of ACEs as well. And I love the work of Dr. Wendy Ellis. If you're not familiar with her, she created the pair of ACEs model, and it's really developed to expand upon that original ACEs study, showing that not only do we need to be thinking about adverse childhood experiences, but we also need to be thinking about adverse community experiences. We need to be looking at somebody's whole environment, because when we're looking at that tree, we have to be thinking about what is in the root, what is in the soil of that tree, to really start to understand what are those risk factors, what are those things that we can go in and really help with, so that we can really move more towards those 4 building blocks of hope and those positive childhood experiences. So, as we transition to positive childhood experiences, we'll start with the very first study that was done. And we'll go through a few of these because there have been a lot of studies that have been done since this original 2015 study. So this originally was done in Wisconsin. They were asking questions in their Burfess survey about ACEs, and they added questions about positive childhood experiences as well, because they really wanted to understand how ACEs and PCEs correlated with mental health. So these were the the top seven positive childhood experiences that they asked questions about. So feeling able to talk to your family about feelings, feel your family stood by you during difficult times, enjoy participating in community traditions, feel a sense of belonging in high school, feel supported by friends, have at least two non-parent adults who took genuine interest in you, or feeling safe and protected by an adult in your home. This is obviously not an exhaustive list of positive childhood experiences, but these were the seven that were focused on and have continued to be studied because these are the ones that research found really have big effects when it comes to mitigating ACEs and the effects of ACEs. So you'll see here that PCEs protect adult mental health. So down at the bottom, you'll see, depending on the PCE scores, we've got 0 to 2 at 51% reporting good mental health, 3 to 5 PCEs, we've got 75% reporting good mental health, and then 6 to 7 PCEs, 87% of those were reporting good mental health. And with these additional studies, they have found that higher PCEs are also associated with lower substance use. So, a 2019 study that occurred in Montana, they saw less cigarette smoking, less alcohol consumption, and lower lifetime odds of illicit drug use, as well as lower lifetime odds of any substance use at all. In 2021 in Tennessee, they did a PCE study and they found that higher PCEs protect overall health. So those with higher PCEs had lower rates of depression, they had lower rates of heart disease. We saw improved physical health and individuals that were more likely to be employed. And in the one of the biggest studies when it comes to positive childhood experiences that was done was in Australia. And this was a longitudinal study to look at what are those positive childhood experiences that are occurring early on in childhood and tracking those results throughout adolescence into adulthood. And they found that higher PCs in childhood improved adolescent mental health, which is huge because we are seeing some of the highest rates of poor mental health, especially in younger generations. And they also saw better academic skills and individuals that were more likely to become employed. And I think this slide is so incredibly powerful because it shows us what these effects and how these PCEs can really reduce the effects of ACEs. So these were from individuals that had scored a 4 or more on that ACEs questionnaire. You'll notice that in that 6 to 7 range, 20% of those individuals reported having depression or poor mental health. And we'll see that that has huge effects when we talk about mitigating the effects of ACEs and also increasing that mental health throughout the lifespan. So, for a moment, as we shift to this hope framework, I want you to write in the chat for me what stands out to you in this picture. What do you notice in this picture? Yeah, holes in the wall, clutter, disorder, no one is interacting, unintended children, lack of family engagement, bugs. Yeah. All right, here's my challenge for you. What are the positives in this picture? What are the positives in this picture? They have food, there's some sort of faith. Yeah. There's pets, they are together, electricity. Yeah. There's shelter. Clothing, absolutely. Yeah. So you'll notice that immediately when I ask those questions, it's immediately that we start kind of seeing all of those negatives. And when we think about kids that are going into, excuse me, not kids, but service providers that are going into the house and have home-based services, they're probably going to notice all of those negatives and all of those risk factors immediately. But imagine the difference it would make if that individual was instead focusing on what that parent was doing right and hearing about what the positives were first before we jumped in to those risk factors and the things that needed to be changed. Because we can't ignore risk factors, especially when it comes to the safety of children. But I don't know about you as a mom, I am constantly feeling like I am doing everything wrong and I am messing up everything. So imagine the difference it would make to hear first what are some of those positives, what are some of those strengths that you see, and then forming that connection and that relationship. And you'll notice that immediately with our brain, we have that type one thinking where it is fast, it is intuitive, it's unconscious. It's really where that implicit bias is held. And when I asked you to identify the positive, we're shifting to that type two thinking. It takes us more time. It's slow, it's calculating, it's solving a problem. It takes more effort, but it really shows us the power of the pause. Being able to take a moment and take a pause and re examine a situation and really shift to that more strengths based approach, because that can change so many relationships and that deep connection that we're wanting to build. So the Hope National Resource Center, their vision is a world that recognizes and honors and promotes positive experiences because they are fundamental to people's health and well-being. These are the four building blocks of hope. So we have the relationship building blocks, so stable, nurturing relationships with other children and adults through interpersonal activities. And so often we are this relationship for kids. So they talk about how to promote access to safe and supportive relationships, we need to be that safe and supportive relationship. So, taking the time to connect with the children around you, sharing information about after school activities, asking parents about their positive experiences, and celebrating those with them and encouraging them to think about those components and what they want to share in that relationship with their children. Sharing information about parent child attachment, asking about other positive adults in children's lives, coaches, teachers, pastors, mentors, playing and connecting with them. We have, as a society, gotten very far away from that play based childhood. So often that play is happening on screen. And the more that we can take those screens away and really build that play and that connection in person, the more that we are nourishing our nervous systems and then being the model when it comes to practicing self regulation and co regulation. The second building block is the environment building block. So, safe, equitable, stable environments for living, playing, learning at home and in school. So, making sure schools are safe spaces for all students, making sure that children and families feel represented. So, looking at the books and posters and programs and handouts are all kinds of families, all genders, all races, and people with disabilities represented, sharing and connecting with local resources that help families have safe, equitable, stable environments, and creating spaces within organizations and homes where individuals can go to feel calm and safe. I call that the calm corner in my home. And we've got different self regulation and calming mindfulness books, and we've got different fidget toys and different things that my 3-year-old can play with to really help bring him into that calm space. The engagement building block, that third building block within the HOPE framework, is that social and civic engagement to develop a sense of belonging and connectedness. So, how do we promote access to that? Asking children about the activities they do outside of school, delighting with them in those activities, working on creative projects, having flyers available for community centers, after school activities. Families can volunteer in the community together, creating new after school activities, or getting involved in a place of worship if that feels supportive. And this last one is probably the biggest building block, and that's that emotional growth building block. So that's learning and playing through that self awareness and self regulation piece. So helping children really name their feelings and practicing self regulation and co regulation with them. And really working to implement those different things, whether it be in your organization or the different environments that schools are in. When we're talking about self regulation and co regulation, we're We're talking about different breathing exercises. We're talking about meditation, grounding practices, mindfulness practices, movements, and different anchors. And you have to find what works for you. So for me, guided meditations may not necessarily work for me because my brain's going in all these different places. But being able to go out in nature and take a walk and take those different deep breaths help to nourish my nervous system and help me practice that self-regulation. And that co-regulation piece is also huge because that happens on an unconscious basis. That is where our children are borrowing from our nervous systems. So asking ourselves, can my nervous system carry the both of us right now? If the answer is no, maybe reaching out to another person that can carry that nervous system for that child, or taking a step away and reaching at self regulation space. And that multi generational approach is huge in this process. We have to be also talking to parents and talking to them about this process because we are working on growing that resilience and really strengthening that muscle. And I love this quote: the roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self possessed other. And this is where I'm going to stop today because I feel like it's so important that I'm being respectful of time and I'm going to be handing it over back to Rachel and to Kim. But I really want us to take a moment and just look at this quote and remember that when it comes to resiliency strategies, when it comes to self regulation and co regulation, all of that starts with us. So, the more that we can identify what helps our nervous system, the more we can identify what feels good when it comes to caring for ourselves, the more we are helping children and youth in our lives grow that resiliency muscle. And the more we are building that connection, the more we are fostering those healing spaces. So thank you so much for having to meet me today. I want to hand it on back to Rachel, and we can answer any questions that have been put in the Q&A or in the chat. Thank you all so much.
Well, I want to say thank you to you, Jessica, because this was so informative and inspiring and hopeful, right? I appreciate kind of the message that um, you shared with us today. I want to note, it seems like we have a little, like some people writing in the chat, some people writing in the Q&A. I'm seeing the question come up again, though, about getting a copy of these slides. I think, again, you had a lot of valuable information that people are excited to gather and continue learning from. So I want to say out loud to everyone, yes, these slides will be available to you, as will the recording for today's session. Because you registered, you will get an email in a couple of days letting you know that the recording is available, as well as a PDF of the slides and the handouts that we dropped in the chat earlier and that we're going to drop again in the chat before you all leave today's session. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that those are available, and also share Jessica's contact information on the screen just in case there are any questions that are lingering that we may not be able to get to in our session today. So there's that. I want to go to one of the questions here that says, would you say this approach aligns with the community resilience model?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful part. There's so many different community resilience models in general, but I think that with the Hope framework, it can be combined and joined with any model that we're looking at that helps build that resilience. And you'll notice also that some of these may even be similar because we're all getting to that root of wanting to promote those positive childhood experiences. But yes, to answer your question, it can absolutely be combined with that and can work very well with a lot of different community resilience models.
Okay, and like I said, if you happen to drop your question in the chat, please go ahead and move it over to the Q&A. And while we wait for that, there was something that you said right at the beginning that I thought was really interesting. It was just a subtle kind of like language term that I wanted to call some attention to, was that some of the content may be maybe activating to your nervous system. I wanted to know a little bit more because I know later you use that some things might be a little bit triggering. So kind of when and how you choose to use those terms.
When to use like the activating your
Versus,
nervous
yeah,
system.
yeah, I just it's the first time I had heard that, and I really appreciated kind of that.
Yeah, so that term actually comes from Dr. Lori Day Satel, who is amazing. She created the applied educational neuroscience framework. So if you are in the schools or you're an educator, I would really encourage you to check that out because it's an amazing framework. But when we're talking about our nervous system being activated, it may be due to different content we're hearing, but also, I don't know about you, my nervous system gets activated when I get behind the wheel. And that's all happening. So it can happen in really mundane moments because there's some sort of, triggering moment or connection. So really checking in and being able to identify how our nervous system is feeling and what kind of nervous system state we're in can be really, really helpful when it comes to our reactions and how we're interacting with others.
I love that kind of narrow it down to even something like getting in the vehicle, or like, I don't know, starting a webinar on the new platform for
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
the
Let me see. How
I
can the,
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
You
I
go.
just saw, I just saw how can the federal agencies promote the resilience in the population level. So there are a lot of beautiful community resilience models which absolutely work on the population level, but honestly, I would say that the first step is educating on adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences. ACEs, even though it's been around since the 1990s, so many people still don't know what ACEs are and don't know how our childhood experiences connect to so many different chronic health problems. So I think really helping people understand and bringing that awareness to ACEs, and then also bringing awareness to the amazing work of the Hope National Resource Center and all of the amazing stuff that they're doing with PCEs can really help when it comes to promoting resilience at a population level.
Thank you. Yep, you were right there with me. That was the question I was going to that had gotten placed in there. There were some questions about some of the research too that you noted earlier, and I think it was uh, talking about kind of like suicide or suicide attempts. So somebody asked in some of that research, if you can call back to it, I know that's earlier in the presentation. Were there differentiations, I guess, there of in that research?
Attempt versus completion of suicide. There wasn't specifically in that study, and I don't think there has been in the additional studies that have taken place. Like one of the biggest additional ACE study that has taken place was the Philadelphia ACE study, which I would encourage everybody to check out. But I don't think there was a differentiation that occurred between the completions. It was mainly focused on the attempts due to the population that was being studied.
Thank you. And I appreciate your recollection because, like I said, I know that was a little bit earlier in the presentation. I wanted to, because I know we're kind of coming to the end here, also highlight your support and your kind of advice and your experience with informing this addition to the Mind Matters 2.0 curriculum that's going to be coming out. Is there anything that you'd like to say about what you've kind of shared and how you've added to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's been there was a really big focus, right, on talking about that ACEs questionnaire and really shifting it more towards that resiliency and those positive childhood experiences. Within the coalition, we do not recommend using the ACEs questionnaire even at an individual level. And we really find that there are much better screeners and different things that you can use if you're wanting to kind of collect some of that information. So yeah, I was really, really excited to work with Carolyn and be able to talk through those different things. And it's been so wonderful to see, the positive childhood experiences added in and the resiliency factors added in, because those are so important, especially when we're talking about balancing and mitigating those effects of ACEs.
I know we are very, very excited about that. So for those of you who enjoyed today's presentation, if you're interested in learning more, like we said, the Mind Matters 2.0 version is in the works and should be available this fall with this content, again, kind of being built into the newest revision. The handouts, if you can't open them in the chat, you should be able to download them. If that still doesn't work, again, they will be sent out with the access to the recording. If we didn't get to your questions today, we will make sure that we follow up with you. Again, I want to say thank you to Jessica for your time here today, and everything that you did. And for everybody else who joined us on today's webinar, I want to point out there's a brief survey at the end of the webinar. So we really appreciate if you take some time to fill that out. Again, the webinar will be available in 3 days on our website, as well as shared to you in a link and a follow-up email, as well as the PDF handouts that we shared in today's session. And then we have our second Wednesday webinar coming up for September. I don't know why that looks a little bit wonky on the screen there, but it's the price of love, keeping relationships safe and financially healthy with Christy Kelly. And I will make sure I can pronounce our other co-presenter's name by September from the SAFE organization. We appreciate y'all being here today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and look forward to hopefully having you join us next month. Thanks, everyone.